Hey, you have arrived at the process. My name is Dr. John Bush. This is lesson 39, Team Analysis Part 5. And I think when I say the word team analysis, I'm focusing on predicting what a good team versus a bad team looks like in terms of wide receivers, running backs, tight ends, quarterbacks. I've covered a lot of that in the previous 4 lessons, so I think you should turn this off and immediately start with part 1 and move up. It's been very interesting to me and certainly will be changing some focus that I have in my drafts coming for this year. So I suggest you do the same. We're all uh, wanting to win our fantasy football drafts, and my experience says that's about 60% of your success on average, and so it's fairly important, and you need to definitely get off to a good start, and that's what we're trying to do with these lessons here. So with that, let's continue. I'm going to focus on wide receivers now. And what is the nature of wide receivers from last year's top 8, the next 8, the next 8, and the bottom 8? In other words, is there something about the team culture, how it's positioned, the conference, that is going to help us in drafting? Where should we be drafting our wide receiver 1s, 2s, and 3s, so forth? And what does the stats actually say? Not just what you would think is common sense, but actually what is statistically significant in answering this question. So I think this table uh, lets us look at this, and we see team types here. The best or top 8, the above average, which would be 9 through 16, below average would be 17 through what would it be? 26, maybe 25th. I don't know, something like that. And then W is the worst, or the bottom 8. And then the average is shown in the grand total. So we look across at wide receiver 1s, and this is after the season's over, so this is after the fact. So the team type is last year's team type. What are we saying here about the average? And we've talked a little bit about this, the wide receiver 1s, 2s, and 3s, 4s, and 5s. And then we just ask about wide receivers in general, and that's over here. And we can see that wide receivers from the best teams are doing better than the other 3 types. And of course, the worst teams are having, on average, the worst wide receivers. So if we break down wide receivers by wide receiver 1s, you always hear people say, well, I'll take wide receiver 1 from a team that even is going to be bad. Well, if you look at the average fantasy points from those teams, and this is from 2013 to last year, you're costing yourself about 80 points per season between the two. That's a significant amount each week. Okay, so some people think it's okay. I mean, if it's the best on the board, late in the draft, okay, but most likely people are going to be taking wide receiver 1s from the bad teams. And I would rather check this out, wide receiver 2 from the best team is the same as the wide receiver 1 from the worst team. So you can see, you can plot and use this table to plot your strategy here on where you should be drafting the wide receivers for this year's draft. I also below have compared these fantasy points to average and got a percentage above or below the average here. So when we see wide receiver 1s, they're actually 118.6%. So that's 18.6% above average here. Above average teams are 9%. And notice below average and worst, you're losing 9% to about 19%. So you're losing value by drafting in this range versus here. Okay, so I know where I want to be hanging out, and it's not from these teams. And you can see that story is strong in wide receiver 2s. Wide receiver 3s, you're still getting some, some good stuff happening in the best teams. Looks like you're all the way down to wide receiver 4s, and it's about the same. And what was interesting, wide receiver 5s, if you do get down to that, you're actually best grabbing those from the worst teams. Probably what's happening is the opportunities and whatnot are pretty much used up in the better teams, and in the worst teams, the 1s and 2s are so crappy that, hey, they're throwing to wide receiver 5s at that point, certainly by the end of the semester. So that's something intriguing you don't hear about. I've never heard about that. It's the whole point of these lessons is to shift your thinking a little bit, and I think this is damn good stuff. Yes, it is. Let's continue. So if you plot this, this is another way of plotting the actual percentile data above average, and we can see that the best teams in the green here they are, 1, wide receiver 2, 3, you're doing great if you're picking from there. And notice that they're all close to about the same. And notice the worst teams with wide receiver 5s. Very intriguing. I would not have I would have predicted a straight line across here, right? I think most people would, and that's not what the data is telling us. In fact, notice that the teams, even in wide receiver 3s, are starting to be about the same. And notice that the bottom 16 teams pretty much are staying the same, wide receiver 1s and 2s. So you're really not getting any advantage here versus the top 16. So I don't know if people slice the cake like that, but they need to, big time. And so that's kind of what the data is saying. So can we believe this data? For instance, notice the difference here is pretty close. So maybe there's a story that's different versus, take a look at that. That's much further and much further still. So I believe stats can tell us, is there really a difference? Is this gap really real in wide receiver 1, 2s, and 3s? That's the question. Is it just by chance, or is this real? Here's the distributions. If you actually look, I plotted all the data here from the teams. Wide receiver 1s from the best teams here, above average teams, below average, and worse. And I think you can look at these are pretty close, whereas these are certainly lower than these two. So there's probably a suggestion that the data was showing us you need to probably stay in here and away from these type of teams. And so When we look at the descriptive stats of those four groups, top 8, the next 8, the next, and the bottom 8, and we look at the means and the average here, means, average, and we see it's only 20-point difference here. Notice 60 points, notice 80-point difference. So there's probably going to be some differences, but we don't say that until the stats say there's real difference. So we do an ANOVA, an analysis of variance, and we look at the p-value, which tells us, is there a difference within the four treatment groups? And the answer is, oh yes, it's 10 to the minus 16th possibility that this is by chance. So it's not random, it's real. And like I said, when you're looking at data and stats, when you see this kind of information, this is just a home run here. This is that run back here when you get that touchdown here. Woo woo, we just scored a data touchdown. And this is very intriguing. So now let's look and see where the differences really are within the groups. We're comparing all the groups. Group A, B, C, and D is the top 8, the next, and the bottom 8. So that's A to D. And notice, which was interesting, that A versus B, no difference. So we can treat, even though the average was 20 points less, statistically, we don't have enough data to, samples to support there is a difference. So we need to behave as if there's no difference in wide receiver ones here from the top 16 teams from last year. Just ignore it and go with it. So you need to be fishing in this pond. Compared the top A to C and A to D, very significant. And what about B? B versus B to C, big difference. C and D are not different. So it's very clear you need to be fishing here and avoid wide receivers here. Okay, it is as clear as crystal clear, right? Clear as your beer. There it is. Nice, sweet. There's that data touchdown. Woo woo. So to me, this is very intriguing for wide receiver ones. So skew your drafting to the better teams. Okay. And that's last year's is as good a stat to look at, because we don't know this year's, right? We can predict this year's, but we don't know it. And this is why I like to look at, previous data and help us. So now we got 16 wide receivers to fish for. Okay. Can you imagine if you grabbed 2 wide receiver ones from the top 16 teams and avoid these guys here, even the flashy rookies and all this other flim-flam that's floating out there, flim-flam that's floating out there. Isn't that good? That's good. Yeah. From those podcasters here. Okay, here it is, folks. This is let the data talk. Let the podcasters do the jive talk. Wide receiver 2s. What do we see here? Check it out. Looks like there's a trend this way, down. And that was interesting because in wide receiver ones, the 9 through 16 was closer to the top 9. We don't see that here. So there's a gap here, a bigger gap. So I would have not have predicted that. So what does the stats tell us? Check it out. Last year's top 8, basically 82, 182, 157. What is that? 60. So it's 25 points difference. Okay. About 50-point difference, about 60-point difference. Makes make a significant shot at winning the league being up in this range versus below with your wide receiver twos. So let's use our stats again. Get our p-value. There is a difference in the treatment groups. I'm very excited to see what, and this is with wide receiver. Okay, wide receiver twos here. Okay. What do we see here? Check this out. This was unexpected. Last year's top 8 is only where you should fish for wide receiver twos. Check it out. A is significant that B, C, and D. Wow, case closed. Notice that B is still significant from C and D. So if you run out of wide receiver twos, then I guess you'll have to go here. But in the previous wide receiver ones, there was no difference in the top 16. Here there is a difference, and you fish in the top 8. You might have actually predicted the opposite. One might have thought the wide receiver ones would have been only from the top 8. And, and that's not what we saw. We actually seen the reverse of what might be considered common sense. Sometimes common sense doesn't jive with the stats. I break to the stats. Okay, others may break elsewhere. That's where I go with my decision making. Really interesting now on my strategies. So staying and fishing for wide receiver ones in the top 16. When those are gone, if there's any wide receiver twos, then I am staying only in the top 8 if they've survived that long in the draft. And if not, then I'm going to the top 9 to 16 teams last year. Okay. And, at that point, people say, well, I guess you better grab a wide receiver too. You could, but, at that point, maybe there's a quarterback out there or a tight end or another running back. At that point, you've kind of exhausted the good fishing. So, depends on where you're at in the draft here. It may not be as clear cut as you think. Wide receiver threes, and I look at the lines here, and to me, I see very close and then a little drop. That's kind of a common sense looking at the data here. Okay, so I'm left wondering, is there really any advantage in fishing in wide receiver threes from the top teams? Okay, we'll see. See what the stats tell us. 112, 94. So what is that, about 18? What is this, 24? What is this, 30? Pretty close now in the gaps from the bottom. Remember, we were talking 60 and 80. Now we're talking 30. So let's see what the p-values say. The p-values say, yep, there's still something different, which is sweet. What is that difference? Wow. Looks to me that you pick your wide receiver threes only from the top 8. That's it. And at that point, there is no difference in these other groups. If all the wide receiver threes are gone from the top 8, it might be better, you may get some sleepers in some of the worst teams, but the stats say there's no difference. So there may be a bias to shopping for your wide receiver threes in the 9th through 16, but the stats say there's no difference. So you may get some advantage here 2 ways: staying in the top 8, or maybe going for some sleeper kind of things. So I think that's really interesting here. So I was surprised by this as well. Sweet. This is such good stuff here. I'm just warming my hands over how great this. Here's your hot takes, folks. Okay. A lot of gum flapping out there in Twitterverse. This is the professor's hot takes using sweet data. Ooh, feels the power. Here's any gaps. I wondered, is there any gap difference in these teams from 1 to 2, just for me to look at? And if you plot the gap difference in percent, I didn't see any difference at all, which is interesting. So, and p-value, nothing. So we stop looking there. So we have a great takeaway here. Wide receiver 1s from the top 16, wide receiver 2s from the top 8, wide receiver 3s from the top 8. Wide receiver 2s, if the top 8's gone, then go to the next 8. Try to avoid the bottom 16. Wide receiver 3s, if you can't get the top 8, then I don't think there's a difference. So I think we now have a plan for our wide receiver drafting. Okay, we have a pathway. Reference class forecasting. We now have a plan. We don't just, flip a coin or, hey, everybody's talking about this one, I better grab it. No. We'll let others fish in those ponds. Okay, we're going deep sea fishing for the big fish. Let the podcasters swallow the guppies. Okay. This is very exciting data to me. Love this stuff. Excellent. This is the process, by the way, and I'm still Dr. John Bush, and the process can be so sweet sometimes. This is some of the sweetness that stats will bring into your fantasy football life. So come back for more lessons here, okay? And let's crush this league. Let's get our drafts and crush these teams here. Okie dokie. Come back.